the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from A Perfumed Scorpion by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. 1. Sufi Education. There is a succession of experiences which together constitute the educational and developmental ripening of the learner, according to the Sufis. People who think that each gain is the goal itself will freeze at any such stage, and cannot learn through successive and superseding lessons. Jalaluddin Rumi put it in beautiful verse in the 13th century. Man gulam I anki da harabat, quishra wazil na danad ba samat, bazrabate ki babaya tak kad, tabamaskam darasid yak ruzmad. I am the slave of whoever will not at each stage imagine that he has arrived at the end of his goal. Many a stage has to be left behind before the traveller reaches his destination. We can run through a number of contentions about education as understood by the Sufis and represented both in their literature, in their stories, and in their traditional ways of communicating materials and inducing experiences, to note both what is new and unfamiliar, and what may fall into the interstices of contemporary educational activity. Monitoring by the teacher maintains progress. Time lag between exposure to impacts and their absorption, together with the fact that people often abolish the impact of a story by fending it off with a wisecrack or a riposte, may make acceptable social behavior, but it can make for lack of sensitivity in the event. Attention to these factors is a part of Sufi expertise and care. The need to monitor one's own reactions and to see why one is behaving in a certain way, self-observation without neurotic self-abasement, may be taken as the next important feature. Even at the very early stage of time lag, wisecrack and self-study, we can easily note how difficult it is for some people to get the measure of what they are doing, how one may not know one's own time lag characteristics, how one may wisecrack automatically, unable to control this response, how one may dive into an orgy of introspection. For this reason, the monitoring of the Sufi teacher may be said to be so necessary as to justify the institution of teachership. The attachment to externals, esteeming the container and not the content, is also a major human tendency, and a further explanation for the presence, or at least the effect, of the mentor. Barriers to learning. The barriers to learning may be noted through illustrative stories or observed in oneself. Secondly, they may be so ingrained through habit that there is a need for an operation of some kind, an exposure to an interchange for them to yield. We have already noted that barriers cannot be dealt with by mechanical structures, by repeatedly telling people not to be subjective, for instance. This merely makes the determination not to be subjective ingrained as a characteristic in itself. It does not impart the quality of being able to do what one thinks one should be doing. Indirect teaching. Indirect teaching and the accumulation of a number of impacts or teachings to make up a single whole is another feature of Sufi study. What is called in some disciplines enlightenment can be, in the Sufi process, the result of the falling into place of a large number of small impacts and perceptions, producing insights when the individual is ready for them. The fact that one may be learning bit by bit, and storing up little pieces of information and experiences which are, almost insensibly, to come together at some later date, naturally does not recommend itself to people who may be offered elsewhere something which, it is claimed, will give them instant insights. Hence the grasping for catch-all categories of teaching, which always claim to be comprehensive. Sufi study, therefore, cannot hope to compete with instant illumination offering systems, just as the much vaunted nostrum called snake oil will claim much more attention from some people than something less dramatic. Yet the drop-by-drop activity of Sufism does cause a certain amount of restlessness, even among those who accept the postulates we have already mentioned. Hence, it is often found that people complain that their studies are not proceeding along the lines they believe to be indicated, as in the case of the tattooed lion story. In this tale, from Book 1 of Rumi's Mathnavi, a man went to a tattooist, asking for the design of a lion to be tattooed on his back. But when he felt the prick of the needle, he cried out in anguish, asking the artist what part of the animal he was working on. "The tail," said the other. "Leave the tail," cried the coward, "and do another part." But when another part of the lion was started, the customer found that it hurt him just as much, and he instructed the tattooist to abandon that area too. This went on until the artist threw his colours and needles on the ground and refused to do any more. So the artist had his wish to leave off the work, and the customer had his wish to be relieved of the pain. But the result was that nothing happened at all. The foregoing questions, too, are tied up in the educational event by the problem of attention. People who have a portion of attention attached to something other than the subject under study will often, it is held by Sufis, be virtually disabled from absorbing the lesson. This has naturally been distorted into the claim that people must marshal and focus every iota of attention before they can learn. This is, of course, the doctrine of 1 aspirin will shift my headache, therefore 1,000 of them will give me higher consciousness. But the nature, quality, and degree of attention is held by the Sufis to be as important as the more easily quantified input in learning situations. Traces of this doctrine of a psychological mean, a movement between two extremes of opinion, belief, or exercise, are indeed to be found here and there in Western literature, though seldom linked with any teaching situation. People will campaign against immodesty with little result other than self-abasement, which may be worse when pursued in excess. As Shakespeare says, self-love is not so vile as self-neglecting. Henry V, Act 2, Scene 4, lines 74 and 75. Overdoing things can be poisonous. Short of the 1,000 aspirins, we can find almost innumerable instances of analogies, if not intended teachings, if only we transpose, for illustration, not necessarily for equivalence, into more familiar fields. I have just noticed a report to the British Royal College of Physicians of work done by Dr. Elwyn Hughes, a University of Wales biologist. Massive doses of vitamin C are believed to ward off the common cold. Dr. Hughes took 350 people and gave them each 80 milligrams of vitamin C, which is just over 2.5 times the recognized normal daily requirement of 30 milligrams. These people contracted 18% fewer colds during the infection season than the control group on 30 milligrams. There was a further group given massive doses of over 80 milligrams a day. No doubt they got even fewer colds. Not a bit of it. Those ingesting over 80 milligrams got no fewer colds than the 80 milligram people. But they did get something else, continues Dr. Hughes. The tendency to form poisonous substances such as oxalic acid in the body. Excessive use of vitamin C, he says, could enhance the dangerous effects of some toxic substances already present in food. Those who have seen the random application of supposedly esoteric practices on would-be illuminates in just such a mechanical fashion will no doubt note the almost uncanny parallel here. Finding further ranges in jokes. When the other requirements are being observed, there is still more which have to be kept in balance. People who, for instance, are accustomed to hearing stories as something to make them laugh, to inculcate a moral or to illustrate a point of doctrine, often find that they are unable to look and listen for other ranges of meaning in a story. They are described by Sufis as not learners at all, at least at that stage and in that condition. They are seen to be people who are attuned to moralism or jokes or dogma. This is why Sufis so often seem to be asking people whether they really are Sufi students, or whether they are in fact students of someone else or something else. Sufis require attention to what they are teaching, in the spirit in which they are teaching it, no less than in the case of more conventional instructors. Similarly, people who come to consume, to be emotionally stimulated, whether by the presence of the teacher or the unfamiliarity and strangeness of the materials, are not students either, for the same reason. Negative and positive operation. It might be said that people are always trying to test the genuineness of the teacher, but I have found more fake students than fake teachers. Then there are those who, listening to what I have just enunciated, will say that we are harping on negatives and not affirming positives. They say this for the same reason as the others say unconsciously what they do, by their reactions. If you have to fill the pitcher, the saying goes, you may have to empty it first. To claim that it should be filled regardless of what is in it, even if that thing is unsuitable, is to say something about your own lack of insight, not about the teaching or procedures. Human completion or psychotherapy. Sufi education is aimed at what the Sufis regard as the fundamental incompleteness of humankind in general. This means that the basic problem must be tackled and not the symptoms. So Sufic education may be aiming, indeed is aiming, for this fundamental role, while the student, that is, the person who imagines himself to be a student, may be asking for psychotherapy, for secrets, for reassurance that his time has not been wasted, and so on. It is because the pitcher is already half full that Sufis have to clear the way to understanding of these basic contentions before real teaching, as distinct from overfilling, can take place. This is not to say that the Sufi wants people to abandon anything which they already know, but it does mean that the Sufi must expect, as any teacher would in any field, that the requisite conditions for learning obtain. If the desire to oppose it, or the desire to consume it, are too strongly marked, there is little prospect of the learning process taking place at all. Sufism learned by means of itself. Sufi study, too, is learned by means of itself, and rarely can even parts of it be approached through the individual claims of other formulations. It has its own postulates, some at least of which are not regarded as basic or even relevant in other systems. It is thus of the greatest importance that the student or observer of the Sufi phenomenon shall realize that Sufis do not teach in terms of other systems, however traditional or modern. Sufi work may vary and illuminate, say, psychology. We have yet to find that, say, psychology can produce a better way of studying or understanding Sufism and its teaching methods. Cult formation as an abnormality. Failure to observe Sufic criteria in trying to learn, very much more often than not, will result in the oversimplifications which lead to a cult, or the trivialization which leads to a vague religiosity, or in the intellectuality which leads to hair-splitting of an often comic kind. All these hypertrophies are well represented in cults and organizations, groups and writings which you can find all around you. I have already more than once publicly invited people to familiarize themselves with these materials, so that they might find out whether they can see things as we do, or whether they prefer the other, partial approaches. Hemispheric brain function. An Eastern position on left and right-hand brain function might well be that, however important these specializations may respectively be, and however useful it can be to define them, there is yet another mode of cognition, though it may be connected with the interplay of the two. On the subject of the two ways of thinking, Omar Khayyam, who died about 8.5 centuries ago, might have been writing in his poem about formalism and belief when he stresses that both ways of thinking give rise to equally fallacious assumptions. Kaume mutafakar and da mazab wadin, jama'e mutahayarand da shak wi yakin, naga manadi ba ayad zikamin, ki iye bekabaran, ra na'an ast na'in. People are thinking about creed and belief, all confused between doubt and certainty. Suddenly a call comes from the beyond. O uninformed ones, the road is neither this nor that. Transposition of concepts. You will observe, as we continue to examine examples of Sufi thought in the educational area, how literal is often deliberately transposed for figurative, and sequential for holistic. I say deliberately because this is not to be confused with the ordinary process by which the one becomes the other through misunderstanding or cultural deterioration. Among the Sufis, the transposition is carried out deliberately, though not as a matter of policy, only in response to situations where there has been, as it were, a congealing of thought. The Sufi teacher's perception of this is generally an inward one, so that the examples which we choose as illustrations are only the crudest, the ones which have aspects which appear in physical encounters and verbal interchanges. And it is worth remembering that this perception by the Sufi is regarded by him as linked with a cosmic intuition, which drives him to work in the field of human education of the Sufic kind. In this feeling he agrees with Einstein that the cosmic religious experience is the strongest and noblest driving force behind scientific research. This may be a driving force, but it is certainly not a discussable one. Speech and experience have opposite characteristics. As Hujwiri 1,000 years ago, quoting a Sufi director, said, "To ask about experience, hal, is absurd, because experience is the annihilation of speech." Awareness of motivation. For the Sufi in his area, as for the teacher in any more familiar one, a major consideration is whether the would-be learner is serious in his desire to learn, and whether he wants to work or play. He may be unaware of his own motivation. True and false teachers. People are always asking how they can distinguish the true from the false among the swarms of Eastern sages competing for their attention. One of the neatest and most enlightening interchanges on this subject I have ever heard is this one. Someone asked a Sufi, "How can I tell a true from a false teacher?" The Sufi replied, "I can tell you how to identify the false one." "Good," said the other man. "Anyone who does not pass your test will be my master. It is not quite as easy as that, the Sufi told him, because you only have to find a supposed teacher who will accept you, as you are, as a disciple. This will be the ignoramus, or the fraud. Contemporary psychology. There has recently been a great deal of interest in relating Sufi knowledge to contemporary educational or psychological theories, and this continues. One of the advantages is that the literate public can, by this method, obtain some outside confirmation that Sufi teaching is authentic in the sense of being based on criteria which are verifiable by accepted methods of assessment. If a Sufi tale seems to show a knowledge of the lateral specialization of the brain, this concentrates some people's minds wonderfully. They feel that Sufism must be genuine, and it may further provide a framework through which some aspects of Sufism can be approached by those who need such reassurance. To the Sufi, however, the need for such activity is minimal. Consumerism in approaching knowledge. Transpose it into a more usual mode. Say, for instance, that people are doubtful of the advantages of a new commodity, but can see how it would fit in with their existing lives by reference to established commerce, customs, or preoccupations. Both they and the people representing the commodity would be pleased, but how far should either party go? Should the intending consumers only concentrate upon the aspects of the new commodity which please them, or reinforce their attitudes or ways? Should the introducers of the commodity put disproportionate effort into explaining these aspects, when the result might be to present the commodity inadequately, or occupy too much of one's time and energy? Again, we have the matter of balance in where attention is put, and by whom. It is perhaps fortunate that the situation does not really arise, since it is our experience that Sufi teaching and learning does not need a hard sell or soft sell, but attracts a sufficient number and variety of people without having to enter into this kind of activity. But the matter should in fact be aired, because there are so many people who will insist on approaching the Sufi study in the consumer way which I mention. Limitations of working with derivative material. There is a distinct value in working with the spin-off from Sufi study. Certain stories and other secondary materials are of great interest to many people in psychology and education today. The materials are felt to be of value to individual disciplines, and no doubt they are. But the degree to which these derivative materials may be used for such secondary or even tertiary purposes really has to be explained. It would be inappropriate to suggest that people in the West imagine that Sufism is a mine of diamonds surrounded by much useless clay which the Westerner has to prize away. It would be equally unworthy to suggest that the contemporary Sufi is elitist about his Sufism. The truth, however, is that the Sufi aim is to Sufis fundamental, and the tradition and methodologies are intact and fully operative. Such room as there is for experimentation and reinventing the wheel here is limited and limiting. You do not go to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for instance, for a device for frightening away evil spirits. Mismatching of ideas does not help anyone. It is unlikely that people now being addressed include any who view Sufi knowledge as containing bits and pieces which could be picked up and fed into existing frames of education or psychology to give them a boost, and so I need not say much about such a primitive attitude towards what is, after all, among the most comprehensive and long-lasting and versatile traditions of man on record. The desire to acquaint oneself with the variety and sophistication of the Sufi approach, however, by means of portions of its instructional methods, is not the same as looking for fragments to loot them for repair work to an existing, perhaps experimental, structure. Sufis always welcome interest in their work which really is objective or altruistic, which really is educational or scientific. But in order to familiarize oneself with the working of an elephant, grabbing the ears or tail will yield little enlightenment, commensurate with the energy employed, about elephants. In Sufi education, therefore, focus, balance, the weight given to different impacts, experiences, the attunement of the learner, these are paramount, and the Sufi teachership mediates these elements. How not to learn. When any part of a form of learning becomes available, it is standard procedure in the human community, almost compulsive behavior, that people pick up pieces which appeal to them for vocational or psychological reasons, and charge off in all directions like Don Quixote, bearing these pieces, which they then elaborate, simplify, and proclaim to be the whole thing, and something to be urgently transmitted to all and sundry. Sufi studies are no exception to this. If you allow yourself to think briefly about what happens in familiar bodies of knowledge, say medicine, philosophy, social or even political ideas, you will see what I mean. The pattern is undeniable. Now, in most such instances, it is customary for an individual or a body of people to attempt to stop this process, or to regularize the situation, by forming a single authoritative institution through which the genuine materials or knowledge and/or practice can be regulated. The Circuses. With the Sufis, the matter is not so simple. With us, the cults are more publicly visible than the authentic teaching. The gurus are more advertised than the substance of the study. The transitional, superseded literature is more available than the measured guidance. The reason for this is that Sufism is, in essence, in its more effective and truest form, too subtle, too delicate, too much based upon perception, to be expressed in the crude externals, the packages which people always at first demand of anything, and which they are consequently widely offered by superficialists. The successive transition from the fine to the crude is characteristic of one way of the human handling of things, and there is little to be done about it. You can hardly deny that some clowns and circuses are Sufis and Sufism unless you can demonstrate in like terms something which is Sufism but which is authentic. Appreciation of Sufism is based on perception of it. Perception of it is different from a crude projection from it, appealing to logical or emotional minds. The onus is on the receiving culture to provide enough people interested on this level if the subtler reality is to find a means of harmonizing with that culture. It is almost, but not quite, a case of people getting the Sufis they deserve. One of the most valuable remarks I heard during my youthful Sufi studies was this one, which yielded more and more as I contemplated it. Teachership is function, not appearance. This visible institution of teachership exists in our dimension not because of the needs of the enlightened. It is there, to the contrary, because of the insensitivity of the ordinary person, who will not perceive what is there until this has been magnified into an external shape. Its first duty is to disappear from appearance and to appear in real action. It seems equally possible to me that the new knowledge of the brain hemisphere's operation may demand a similarly subtle institution to be devised for it, eventually. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.